They found the body, but the man was still alive. They found the body at sunrise, half buried in the icy bend of the Serpent River, face down in the reeds like the earth itself was trying to swallow him. His skin was pale and bloodless, lips blue, neck twisted at an unnatural angle, as if some invisible hand had gripped it too hard. His clothes were torn and waterlogged, the velvet sash around his waist knotted with riverweed. There was no question who it was. The guards didn't need to check for a pulse, didn't need to turn him over. Everyone in the kingdom knew that face, even caked with mud. It was the prince, the only son of the king, the heir, the future. But now, he was just a husk. They carried him back in silence, wrapped in black cloth, guarded like treasure. Not a single bird sang that morning, and when the news reached the palace, the sky turned gray without a single cloud. The court stopped breathing, and then the silence shattered into 1,000 sharp pieces of fear. If the prince could die, the one with the finest tutors, the best guards, trained in combat, diplomacy, philosophy, and charm since the age of 3, what hope did anyone else have? The king announced his son's death with a voice that trembled once, then locked into steel. "My son," he said, standing before the court, "was taken by the hand of fate, but his name will not be forgotten." He called for 7 days of mourning. The bells tolled, the nobles wept, some sincerely, some with calculation. The people gathered outside the palace gates with candles and songs. The queen remained in her chambers, curtains drawn, her silence mistaken for grief, but thick with something else. The body was not shown. The official word was preservation. The river had done too much damage. The undertakers needed time. A closed casket, they said, was a kindness. But those who worked closest to the body said otherwise. They said he was nearly untouched, that his wounds didn't match the story, that his expression wasn't peaceful. It was confused, like a man who didn't understand how he'd ended up dead. The casket was carved from white stone and crystal, laced with silver veins mined from the southern mountains. It was placed in the royal tomb under the watch of the crown's shadow, the elite order sworn to guard the dead as fiercely as the living. The funeral would be held in 1 week, 7 days for the kingdom to prepare to bury a future that had only just begun. But on the 3rd night, the tomb was opened, not broken into, not desecrated, simply opened, quietly. Like someone with the right key had entered, taken what they needed, and left everything else undisturbed. The guards swore they saw nothing. The locks bore no signs of tampering. The casket was still there, but the body, the prince, was gone. The king ordered silence. Anyone who spoke of the missing body would vanish. The court was told the burial would continue as planned. The casket was filled with weighted cloth and sealed again. The royal procession would march through the city with honor and music and mourning, and none would know that the man they grieved wasn't inside. But the whispers began anyway. They always do. A farmer claimed he saw a man walking along the riverbank at dawn, soaking wet, muttering strange words in a tongue he couldn't recognize. A traveling bard swore he served wine to a man who looked exactly like the prince, thinner, colder, but unmistakable, and that the coin he paid with bore the royal crest, a crest only minted for the heir. A washerwoman said she saw a shadow watching her from the trees near the edge of the palace wall, a tall figure with eyes that glowed faintly in the dark, just like the prince's had when he was a boy. The guards dismissed it all as grief hallucinations, tricks of the mind, the product of a people in mourning. But the king didn't. He summoned his spies, the men who wore no uniforms and answered only to blood, and sent them searching, not for an assassin, but for a ghost. Then came the message. Delivered not by raven or courier, but by a crow, an old one with feathers black as oil and eyes like polished stone. It landed on the king's windowsill, scratched the glass once, and waited. Tied to its leg was a single scroll, sealed with black wax, bearing the royal signet, the very ring the prince had worn on the day he died. The seal was unbroken. The scroll contained no greeting, no signature. Only 5 words, "You buried the wrong man." That was when the fear became terror. The king read the message aloud only to his most trusted advisors. He said nothing. His hand shook for the first time in 20 years. That night, the captain of the royal guard was found missing. His armor lay in a perfect stack outside the chapel, still warm. The high priest claimed he saw a shadow pass through the sanctuary just before dawn. Not a ghost, not a thief, a man. The spies returned one by one, offering nothing, no sightings, no suspects, no answers. But the servants, the ones who swept the halls and washed the linens and carried the trays into rooms they weren't supposed to hear, they spoke in whispers. "The body wasn't his," one said. "His hands were wrong." "I heard the prince had a brother," murmured another. "A twin, hidden at birth to protect the line." "They say he dabbled in the old ways," said a third. "In magic that lets you wear another's face." By the 6th night, the kingdom held its breath. And then, at dusk, someone knocked on the palace gates. Not the grand entrance, the servants' gate. The side door no one ever used unless they wanted to go unnoticed. The knock was soft, repeating, steady. A kitchen boy answered, annoyed. He opened the door and screamed, because the man standing there looked exactly like the dead prince. He was barefoot, covered in mud and blood, wearing torn silks and nothing else. His eyes were wild, not from madness, but from something deeper. His lips were cracked, his breath ragged, but his voice, when it came, was clear. "I need to see the king." He collapsed on the floor. 2 guards rushed forward. One dropped his sword. The other stared, pale as bone. Neither could deny what they saw. It was the prince, but not as they remembered him. He was older somehow, not in years but in weight, as if he'd lived 1,000 lifetimes in 7 days, as if he'd died and come back. When he woke in the royal infirmary, surrounded by silence, he asked only one question. "Did you bury him?" The king stood at the door, unsure whether to run or kneel. "Who?" he whispered. The prince looked him straight in the eye. "My double," he said. "The one who took my name. The one who tried to take my life." And then he smiled, not cruelly, but with purpose. "I remember everything now." He sat now in the king's private chamber, his breathing shallow, his back straight, a bruise blossoming along the side of his jaw, and 3 broken ribs pressing against the fabric of his tunic every time he exhaled. He wore no crown, bore no sword, and yet he commanded the silence like a general. His eyes, sharp, clear, terrifyingly calm, never left his father's. The king stood with one hand braced on the windowsill, knuckles white, staring at the man he had once carried in his arms, the son he had buried, the heir he had failed to protect. "If you are truly him," the king whispered. And it wasn't a challenge. It was a prayer, a hope barely strong enough to hold itself together. "Then prove it." The man did not flinch. He spoke softly, not for drama, but because the truth never needed to shout. He spoke of a promise made under the old lavender tree when he was 7, when the king knelt before him and swore that no matter what war or weight came with the crown, he would never make him carry it alone. He spoke of the night he fell through the ice on the lake and the king had pulled him out, his hands raw and bleeding, sobbing as he wrapped the boy in furs and carried him all the way to the chapel. He spoke of a lullaby only the queen used to sing, the words never written down, the melody off-key but perfect, and as he sang the first line, trembling and broken, the king's face collapsed. He dropped to his knees, and in that moment, he knew. His son had returned. But the story he brought with him was not a tale of survival. It was a warning. The man who had come back wasn't whole, and not because he was injured, but because part of his life had been stolen. He had been replaced, and the kingdom had watched it happen. He told it plainly without pause. He had a twin, born in secret, raised in silence, hidden not out of fear but design. Because the law decreed only one heir could be named, and the royal bloodline, paranoid from a centuries-old war between two twin kings, had sworn to never let that history repeat itself. One heir was always erased, disappeared at birth. But this time, the second son had not vanished. He had been kept, raised in the old West Wing behind stone and silence, beneath a false report of fire damage that had supposedly made the rooms uninhabitable. The boy had been taught everything the prince was taught: speech, swordplay, strategy, history, but without love, without identity, without a name, a reflection, not a brother, a contingency plan. The prince had discovered the secret by accident. A journal belonging to his mother, hidden behind loose bricks in her former chambers, filled with ink-stained grief and desperate apologies. She had not known how to save both her children, so she had saved the one she could touch. But the guilt had never left her, and in those pages she had left a map. The prince followed it, past the guards who claimed the West Wing was sealed, through the corridors where the air grew too still, and down to a door with no handle and a lock that looked like it had never been made to open. He found the twin, not a boy, a man, same age, same face. But the eyes were wrong. They didn't reflect light. They swallowed it. They spoke. For hours. The twin had been waiting, he said, for the day the real prince would come to him, to acknowledge him, to set him free. But he didn't want freedom. He wanted identity. He wanted the throne. He wanted the life he was promised before he was erased. And he believed the crown could hold them both, that they could rule together, two halves of the same whole. But the prince had refused, not because he hated him, but because he could see the madness beneath the surface. A lifetime of secrets had shaped his brother into something cunning, something desperate, something hungry. That night the prince was drugged, not poisoned but silenced. A sleeping potion slipped into his tea, strong enough to kill most men, but laced with herbs that would preserve the body. He remembered the cold, the weight of hands carrying him, the press of soil, the dark, the muffled voices chanting old words, and then silence. He had been buried in a ritual chamber beneath the palace, not to rot, but to disappear. And in his place, the twin had stepped into the light. The switch was seamless. The ring was placed on his finger. The scars were copied. The smile was rehearsed. But something cracked. Maybe the twin hesitated at the wrong moment. Maybe a childhood friend noticed his laugh didn't sound the same. Maybe the mirror in the royal chapel, the ancient one that no longer reflected faces but intentions, flickered when he passed. And then the accidents began. A page boy vanished. A stablemaster was found drowned. The queen's old maid fell from the tower. Anyone who might have known the truth began to vanish, quietly, one by one. And the kingdom, grieving and blind, never asked why. The funeral was staged. The weight in the coffin was silk and stone. And the prince, the real one, clawed his way out of the dark, not because he was lucky, but because his name would not die in silence. Now he had returned, but the twin was gone. Disappeared into the palace, into the robes, into the throne, into the very skin that had once belonged to the boy who now sat bruised and breathing in front of the king. The room held its breath. The king asked one question, not to challenge him, but to seal the truth. "Where is he now?" And the prince answered without blinking. He never left. They sealed the doors to the war room at midnight, not because of a siege or rebellion, but because of something far more dangerous, a secret too big to be trusted with the wind. Only a handful were allowed inside: the king, the general of the royal guard, the head of the court's spies, and the prince who had come back from the dead. The same room that had once charted battle campaigns and peace treaties now held the greatest threat the kingdom had ever known. Not an army, not a plague, but a man who wore another man's skin. The table was wide, the maps were rolled away, the torches burned low, and the silence was heavier than armor. The prince stood at the far end, not by the throne, but by the wall, as if he had no desire to reclaim the seat that had been stolen from him. His voice was steady as he spoke, his breath slow, his hands behind his back, like a soldier giving a report. He told them the twin had not run. He hadn't fled to the borders or hidden in the hills or sailed into the night. He was here, in the palace, in plain sight, and worse, he had already begun to rule. The king refused to believe it at first. He argued that he would have known, that he had seen his son daily, dined with him, held court at his side, that no impostor, no matter how skilled, could have fooled him for weeks. But the prince didn't argue. He simply asked one question. "When was the last time he touched you?" The king froze. Not a hug, not a hand on the shoulder, not a warm word whispered near the ear. For weeks now, the prince who sat on the throne had remained distant, sharp, unreadable. And the more the king thought about it, the more he realized he had been afraid of his own son, because something in him had changed. Not his voice, not his face, not even his mannerisms, but the way he looked at people, like he was studying them, cataloging them, dissecting them with his eyes, like everyone around him was a game piece he could move if he smiled just right. And that was the proof. Because the real prince never played games. They devised a plan. Quiet, careful, deadly. The real prince would remain hidden. No servants, no sightings, no whispers. Only a handful of guards would know, each sworn by blood oath. Meanwhile, the court would proceed as usual, but inside it, a trap would be laid, not with steel or spells, but with memory. The court's first gathering after the funeral was meant to be ceremonial, a commemoration of the prince's life, led by the very man now suspected of stealing it. The twin arrived draped in mourning robes, every movement precise, every word measured. He gave a speech that drew tears from the lords and praise from the scribes. He spoke of loss and strength, of the legacy his brother left behind, and how he would carry that legacy forward with honor. No one questioned him. No one doubted, because he was perfect. Too perfect. Until he made the mistake. A child in the crowd, barely 7. The son of a nobleman who had once served as the prince's tutor. The boy ran forward after the ceremony, climbed the stairs, and threw his arms around the twins' legs, crying. "You promised to teach me the dragon song," he said. "The one we made up with the 3 wrong notes." The twin smiled, stiff, awkward. "Of course I did," he said. "I'll teach it to you next week." The boy pulled back, confused. "But we already finished it. You said never to sing it where the court could hear." And just like that, the illusion cracked. The child was pulled away. The twin recovered, laughed, blamed grief. But behind the curtains, the real prince watched. He knew the twin wouldn't run, not now. He would dig in deeper, use the court's loyalty, use the people's trust. And so the prince moved quickly. That night he visited the chapel, the oldest part of the palace. The walls still bore scars from the old fire, and in the flickering candlelight, the stone reflected memories no one else could see. He knelt before the mirror, the one that never showed lies, only what the soul carried, and looked into it. He saw both of them, himself and the twin. One scarred, the other smiling, One weary, the other calculating. One carrying pain, the other carrying ambition. And in that reflection, the prince understood the truth. They were not two halves of a whole. They were not one soul split. They were rivals, mirror-born enemies, and only one could survive. The next day, the court held a feast. It was tradition. The day after the royal mourning, a celebration of life was required. Wine flowed, music echoed, dancers twirled across the marble, and at the center sat the impostor, wearing the crown like it belonged to him, laughing as if nothing was out of place. But beneath the table, in hidden tunnels carved centuries ago by masons who feared assassins, the real prince was moving. He climbed up through a hatch in the back of the hall. He passed through secret doors known only to the bloodline, and at the precise moment the false prince raised his goblet for a toast, the real one stepped out from behind the columns. He said nothing. He didn't need to. The hall went still. Two princes, one crown. Every eye turned between them like a pendulum trying to choose the truth. The twins stood, calm. "An illusion," he said, voice steady. "A cruel trick." The real prince walked forward. "A trick can't sing the dragon song." And then he did. Softly, off-key. Just like the boy remembered. Just like his mother used to laugh at. And when he finished, there was silence. And then, someone clapped. The king, slowly, deliberately, eyes locked on the twin. And then the general clapped, and the head priest, and one by one. The court rose. But not all. Some remained seated. Their loyalties already bought, their truths already sold. And in that moment, the kingdom split. One prince in the light, one prince in the fire, and only one throne. The great hall was never meant to hold silence. It was built for echo, for music and command and the clatter of goblets raised high. But now every stone seemed to brace itself, as if remembering the weight of history pressing down. Two men stood in the center, shoulder to shoulder in blood and birth, each wearing the same face, the same chin, the same eyes that once made the queen smile and the generals kneel. And yet, no one could look at them without knowing the truth was split down the middle. Because this wasn't a trick of the mirror anymore. This was a reckoning. The prince, the real one, the one who had clawed back from burial and betrayal, didn't move. He stood like memory itself, heavy with the dust of truth, watching as the twins slowly stepped down from the dais. No guards moved, no hands reached for swords, because the moment held something older than politics. It held prophecy. The twins smiled, not the smile of a brother, but of a man who had rehearsed this moment in dreams soaked with envy. "You're good," he said, low enough that only the prince could hear. "But you're too late." The prince didn't blink. "I was dead. I'm never late again." The twins' knuckles turned white where they gripped the edge of the table. "You don't understand. They've already chosen." The prince's voice didn't rise, didn't waver. "Number you made them choose when you tried to bury me, and now they'll choose again, with their eyes open." The court hadn't moved. Not yet. The nobles watched like statues frozen between war drums. Some had wept at the return of the heir. Some had whispered prayers. But others had only narrowed their eyes, weighed their options, calculated their futures. Because loyalty in a court like this was rarely about truth. It was about survival. The king stood. His crown caught the firelight, but his face was old, not just in years, but in cost. He had watched his sons be broken by a system he had helped build, one raised on love, the other on secrecy, both torn by a kingdom that feared the past more than it trusted the future. "I will not let this court turn into a stage," he said, voice hoarse. "You both carry my blood, but only one of you carries what I gave my name to." He turned to the twin. You're not my mistake. You're my consequence." And then he turned to the prince. "You're my only chance to make it right." The twin lunged, not toward the king, toward the prince. A blade slipped from his sleeve, short and curved, meant for a throat, not a fight. But the prince was ready. His hand caught the wrist mid-strike, twisted, and the blade fell to the stone with a ringing note that sounded like prophecy snapping in half. The guards still did not move, because this was not a moment for intervention. This was judgment. The twin pulled back, breathing hard, eyes wild. "You think they'll follow you?" he hissed. "You think they'll forgive your disappearance? Your silence? While I kept the kingdom breathing? You were gone." The prince stepped forward. "I didn't disappear. I was buried. You just didn't dig deep enough to kill me." The twin's rage cracked through his mask. "You never deserved it. The name, the attention, the future. You had everything. I was the one they left in the dark, with a tutor who beat me, a priest who taught obedience instead of belief, and a chamber without windows for a childhood. And you think you're the hero?" The prince's voice was soft. "Number, I think we were both broken. But only one of us chose to become a monster." The twin screamed, not a cry of pain, but of collapse. A sound that came from the soul's final unraveling. He charged again, fists first, teeth bared, but this time the prince didn't catch him gently. He met him full force. They crashed to the marble like fallen angels, limbs flailing, hands clawing for leverage, not like warriors trained for battle, but like brothers fighting for the right to exist. Gasps rang out. Nobles recoiled. The king's eyes filled with something like mourning. The two identical sons bled together on the floor. But it was the prince who rose, bruised, shaking, one eye swelling shut, blood at his collar, but standing, and the twin remained down, not unconscious, just done. Because when the prince stepped back and looked to the court, they did not flinch. They did not doubt. They bowed, not all, but enough. And then the first sword dropped. It was the general of the Southern Legions, a man whose loyalty had been bought a dozen times, who knelt and placed his blade at the prince's feet. "I followed the mask," he said. "Now I follow the man." One by one, more followed. Knights, ambassadors, advisors. Even the high priest, who had once blessed the twin during the false coronation, stepped forward and lowered his eyes. But not everyone moved. 3 lords stood still, unmoved. One reached for his dagger. The prince didn't stop him, because someone else did. A servant, a boy, no name, no title, just a kitchen hand who had seen too much and said too little. He tackled the lord before the blade cleared the sheath. The hall erupted, not in chaos, but in clarity. Loyalty had lines again, and truth was its blade. The twin was dragged away in chains. He didn't scream. He smiled. And that was the most terrifying part. He knew something. He had lost the crown, but not the game. The prince, barely standing, turned to the king. He wasn't working alone, he said. He couldn't have pulled this off without help. Somewhere in these walls, someone else was watching, guiding, and they haven't made their move yet. The king nodded, eyes hollow. Because this was no longer a fight for a throne. This was a war for history, and the next move would not be public. It would be whispered, planned, buried. But the prince was ready. Because he had already survived death once, and this time, he would bring light to every shadow they hid in. The dungeon where they kept him wasn't deep, but it was quiet. No chains, no torches, just walls that listened. The twin sat there without struggle, without requests, without words. He didn't eat much, didn't sleep. He stared at the stone and smiled like a man who had planted seeds in secret and was waiting to hear them bloom. The prince visited him only once, standing just beyond the iron door. No guards, no swords, no witnesses. He didn't say anything. and neither did the twin, because in that silence everything between them was understood, that they had been born into a war neither of them declared, and only one of them had made it out human. The prince left without opening the door, but he didn't forget. Above ground, the palace shifted like a structure remembering its foundations. The tapestries were taken down and replaced with maps of the kingdom's oldest regions, the forgotten towns, the border villages that had been left off official records for decades. The royal historians were summoned, the census scrolls re-examined, the walls were scraped clean of the false heir's proclamations, and behind every torn banner there was a shadow, a note, a seal, a code left behind. The twin hadn't ruled alone, and the network was deeper than anyone knew. The prince restructured the court, not with blood, not with fear, but with fire. He stood before the council, eyes still bruised from the fight, and declared that titles would no longer be inherited, they would be earned, that those who had served silence would be stripped of lands and legacy, that from this moment on, truth would be written in ink that could not be erased by gold or lineage. Many supported him, some vanished, others waited. Always there were those who waited, because revolutions do not end with crowns, they begin with memory. The people, too, had changed. In the streets, they whispered about the man who had returned from the grave. Some called him chosen, some feared him, but most simply watched. Carefully. They had followed the wrong prince before. They would not be fooled again. So the real prince didn't beg for their love. He walked among them instead, unannounced. No guards, no cloak. Just a man in the market, listening to what the people said when they thought the palace wasn't listening. He learned their fears, he heard the hunger, and he remembered their names. He repaired the bridge that had collapsed during the funeral parade, not with stone, but with labor. He stood alongside the masons, sleeves rolled, dirt on his palms. And when a child asked why a prince would carry bricks, he said, "Because the weight of this kingdom should not fall only on your father's back." That story spread faster than gold. But stories could not protect him forever. One night, weeks after the twins' capture, a message arrived. No seal, no sender, just a single word carved into bone. Another. They found the ambassador's body the next morning, poisoned, eyes wide, mouth twisted, fingers curled into fists. Under his tongue, a ring, royal, identical to the prince's. And that was when he knew. The twin was not the only one. The royal bloodline had always been more afraid of prophecy than invasion. Centuries ago, after the War of the Twins, the monarchy had secretly authorized a program, a project hidden beneath charity and orphanage walls, to collect children who matched the line, bastards, doubles, look-alikes, raised not with love but with purpose, in case the crown ever needed to disappear. And now they were returning. Not as allies, as predators. Each trained, each forgotten, each angry. But the prince did not run. He convened the court again. He stood where the twin once stood, and he said the words no king had dared speak aloud in 100 years. I am not the only one who wears this face, but I am the only one who carries what matters, the truth of what has been done to keep a throne warm. He paused, looked each lord and lady in the eye. I won't kill them. I will find them. I will show them a world that does not need to be stolen. Some called him naive. Some called him brave. But most, for the first time, called him king. And so the search began. Not a hunt, a calling. Messages were sent through the old channels, coins marked with crescent scars, songs hummed in markets that carried meanings beneath melody, and slowly from the edges of the world they began to come. Some in chains, some in silence, some in anger. But each one faced the prince, and each one was told, "You were not born to be forgotten. You were born to remind this kingdom what it did in its sleep." He didn't offer them power. He offered them purpose. Some chose exile, some chose to kneel. One chose to end her life. But the walls of the palace grew taller not in height, but in strength, because now they held names, real names, carved not in marble, but in memory. The twin in the dungeon never spoke again. He lived, and that was worse, because every day he woke, the bells rang, not for him, but for the man who bore the name rightly. And that was his prison. In the years that followed, the prince rebuilt not just the kingdom, but the truth. He opened the archives. He unsealed the vaults. He restored the name of every erased twin, every lost child, every soul broken by a lie. And when he finally lay dying, old, beloved, tired, he gave only one order. "Tell the next ruler this: I was not the best king. I was just the one who survived long enough to tell the story right." And that story, the one they buried, became legend. They found the body. But the man never died, because truth, once raised, does not go back into the ground.